George, you also were a chauffeur at one time in your life. Did you ever chauffeur anybody famous?
Yep, the great Wilt Chamberlin. Wilt and I were good buddies. We played against each other a lot on the playgrounds in Philadelphia. Wilt was an unbelievable high school player at Overbrook High in West Philadelphia. And so we spent a lot of time together, and I'd go over to Wilt's house. He lived on Cobbs Creek Parkway. He had these two big Great Danes. He fed them whole steaks and so forth. And so this one summer, he now has lined up all these camps up in Catskill Mountains in New York to speak. And he's getting big time money for it. And so he didn't want to do all the driving alone. So I'm over his house one evening. He says, "Hey, I got all these camps lined up. You want to go with me?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'll pay you to drive, and I'll pay you so much a day to drive, and you can help me with the demonstrations, and I'll compensate you really well." And he did. And so he had this purple Bentley convertible. And so I drove this thing all throughout the Catskill Mountains, and we'd do a camp in the morning, camp in the evening, and then we'd go shoot. Usually, whatever camp we did in the afternoon and evening, Will would go out and shoot and work on his game a little bit. And the thing I always remember when we'd be driving along, he would have these little dumbbells that he would be lifting while we were driving. He was the strongest guy I ever saw. Unbelievable arms in that. And the seats were all specially positioned so that he could get his legs up under the steering wheel and so forth. And that was one of the highlights of my career, because it really we were together so much that we knew each other like the back of our hands, and I grew to understand that Wilt was far more than just a basketball player. He was a closet intellectual. He really knew a lot about life, and really had a thirst to know a lot about life, and could carry on a conversation with most people about anything.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to ask you about the nightlife. You've always said that you think he was the most dominant college player.
Most dominant player.
Most dominant player, right?
In the history of the game,
right? Because at every level, including high school. And your reasoning is why? Because
the reason I say that he's the best player of all time, and God knows I'll get slapped across my head from behind from Michael, but I base it not on how many championships they've won, but I base it on who had the greatest impact on the game, and from my perspective, I believe Wilt did, because he constituted more rule changes than any player in the history of the game. The 3 seconds is a rule.
Right.
The widening of the lane is a Wilt rule. Right. Very few people can.
With the offensive rebound.
You can't. Once the ball leaves the shooter. Well, I'm not going to answer this, and you're going to answer it. Okay. So
I wanted to make sure you knew.
So you throw it up. And once the ball leaves the shooter's hand, you cannot touch the ball, because what Wilt used to do is this ball just got close to the rim, he would guide it the rest of the way in. And most people never get this one. You can't take the ball out behind the backboard. Most people say, oh, because it obstructs the throw-in. No, at Overbrook, they would stand Wilt in the middle of the lane in front of the rim, and the guy who took the ball out of bounds would just throw it over the top of the backboard. Wilt would catch it and dunk it. And the reason you can't leave the foul line until the ball hits is because Wilt would get at the back of the circle, run to the foul line, take off and glide in and dunk it. I still say that's why he was a bad foul shooter. And he constituted more rule changes than anybody. And if you go in the NBA record book right now, he still holds more records than any player in the history of the game. And so I think he's had a greater impact on the game than any player. But most people will use as a criteria how many championships you won. And believe me, outside of Michael's children and his family and his wife, they're no bigger Michael Jordan fan in the history of the world than me. And so it's hard for me when someone says, who's the best player to ever play, that I pass on Michael and say, Wilt Chamberlin. But, and I also try to keep in mind there are different eras. Who was the best player in this era? Who was the best player in this era? Who was the best player in this era? And I think it's probably a more objective way of analyzing it.
Well, you know, if you ask old timers, they always tell you who are the best players. They would tell you old timers, and young kids tell you young kids. The one thing I've always said is you can talk all you want about who's being where, but there are two guys from the old days who not only could play now, but would be better. And Wilt Chamberlain's one, and Pete Maravich is the other one.
Right. And you could probably throw Wes and Elgin Baylor.
Yeah, I mean, those guys could.
But I'm going to tell you the guy who always gets lost in the conversation, and it's sinful, is Oscar Robertson. I'm telling you, it's sinful. When most people get into the argument, it's going to come down to Bill Russell and Michael Jordan. It's usually where when it's all said and done, and the heat subsides, it gets down to those two. But let me tell you something. Oscar Robertson's got to be in that equation. The guy was. I mean, he was doing triple doubles before they even had a connotation for triple doubles.
When somebody has a triple double now, they make a big deal of it. He averaged triple double.
Yeah, and it's a little bit sad that he doesn't have more passionate spokesman to speak up and build an argument for him. Because I really believe I could build an argument for him being the best of all time too. So to me, when you get into talking about who was the best of all time, there's no way you can even start the discussion without Russell, Jordan, and Oscar Robertson being part of it. And then you add people on. The unfortunate thing with Oscar is he came in the same era with Wilt. They were pretty much contemporaries.
Yeah, the thing with those guys is that people never saw them, and if they did see them, they see those old black and white, videos. And the short shorts. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't look like guys who play. But I mean, the greatest thing, and I think you probably got me to read the book. It was something on the brothers who coach Baltimore Ravens, the Harbaughs, and John Harbaugh from the Ravens, because they always talk about comparing the two of them. He said, I never try to compare any two people because somebody always gets devalued. Mm-hmm. When people talk about who's better, Magic or Michael, they always end up with stuff like, Magic couldn't shoot, or they always try to demean someone else instead of just saying, here's how great this guy is. You know what? There have been some great players, and those guys were some. But what I meant with the Wilt, and West could play out too, but I mean Wilt now, in the era of there aren't very many low post players, shot blockers and things, the way guys rotate now and the way guys double team. Wilt was a great passer. Remember the year that Wilt won it?
He led the league in scoring, rebounding, and assists.
Yeah. And that was because people said, well, you can't pass. So he decided he was going to lead the league in assists.
The one thing you didn't want to do with Wilt was tell him he couldn't do something. Right. Because then he's going to go out and prove you wrong right away.